Well, here in Acts 14, we are definitely understanding the phrase that no good deed goes unpunished. As the church is growing, seeing lots of growth, lots of success among Gentiles, the Jewish communities hate the church and are persecuting the church. So as the church is growing, the persecution against it is growing as well. We're going to see a lot of that today. So verse 1, and it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake, that a great multitude both of the Jews and also of the Greeks believed. So even Jews believed, and Greeks or non-Jews believed the gospel as well. And they're in the Jewish synagogue over in Iconium. Verse 2, but the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil, affected against the brethren. So they're trying to create an argument against this gospel of Jesus Christ. So in Mosheim's book, Ecclesiastical Histories, he says, the Jews who lived out of Palestine in the Roman provinces did not yield to those of Jerusalem in point of cruelty to the innocent disciples of Christ. We learn from the history of the Acts of the Apostles and other records of unquestionable authority that they spared no labor, but zealously seized every occasion of animating the magistrates against the Christians and setting on the multitude to demand their destruction. The high priest of the nation and the Jews who dwelt in Palestine were instrumental in inciting the rage of these foreign Jews against the infant church by sending messengers to exhort them not only to avoid all intercourse with the Christians, but also to persuade them in the most vehement manner. For this inhuman order they endeavored to find out the most plausible pretexts, and therefore they gave out that the Christians were enemies to the Roman emperor, since they acknowledged the authority of a certain person whose name was Jesus, whom Pilate had punished capitally as a malefactor by a most righteous sentence, and on whom, nevertheless, they conferred the royal dignity. So this is part of the challenge that is coming up against them, is they're going, wait a minute, you're following a guy that was lawfully accused and sentenced to death by a Roman leadership. You're following a guy who's a rebel against Rome. So now they're stirring these Gentiles up to go against the Christians, basically. What's interesting is this idea of, and made their minds evil, affected against the brethren. This is a Greek idiom, which means to make their souls bitter. That's Vehement from his book, The New Testament. So that's what they're trying to do, is get the Gentiles angry at the Christians. Like, you're following a false person. Verse 3, long time therefore abode they, speaking boldly in the Lord, which gave testimony unto the word of his grace, and granted signs and wonders to be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, and part held with the Jews, and part with the apostles. So this is, some people followed Paul and Barnabas, some followed the Jews. Verse 5, and when there was an assault made both of the Gentiles and also of the Jews with their rulers, to use them despitefully and to stone them. So now there's violence against Paul and Barnabas and their followers. They were aware of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lieth round about. So Lycaonia is predominantly a Greek-speaking area, basically. Now verse 7, and there they preached the gospel. There sat a certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him, and perceiving that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, stand upright on thy feet, and he leapt and walked. So this is a miracle that Paul has done, a blessing he did. Spencer W. Kimball, in his talk on the administration to the sick, says the need of faith is often underestimated. The ill one and the family often seem to depend wholly on the power of the priesthood and the gift of healing that they hope the administering brethren may have, whereas the greater responsibility is with him who is blessed. The major element is the faith of the individual when that person is conscious and accountable. Thy faith hath made thee whole was repeated so often by the Master that it almost became a chorus. So what President Kimball's pointing out here, that even though Paul had priesthood authority and could heal, it was the faith that this crippled man had that was what healed him. Paul was just a vehicle through the priesthood, but this man's faith allowed him to be healed by Paul. So our faith to be healed is super important. We need to always realize that. Our faith, we can't just, we need a blessing, we're going to call on the elders of the church to come give us a blessing because they hold the priesthood, and I don't need to do anything about it. That's not how it works. It's based on your faith. Your faith to be healed. The more faith you have, the more healing that can come. So have your faith strong. Keep working on your faith. Really, the goal is have strong faith before you get sick or have an injury or problem, so that you're prepared to ask for those kinds of blessings to help you out. That'd be the ideal situation, honestly. Okay, so verse 11, and when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Laconia, which is Greek, the gods are come down to us in the likeness of men. Again, that is a philosophy, that is an idea that would absolutely work with Greek philosophy. So that's their interpretation of things, basically. Verse 12, and they called Barnabas Jupiter, and Paul Mercurius, because he was the chief speaker. So again, this is the Greeks are trying to understand what's happening. And in their culture and traditions, they're trying to think of their ideas of God, basically, with Paul and Barnabas. So when Paul healed the crippled man at Lystra, the people in the area who believed in and worshipped idols thought he and Barnabas were gods, and they sought to worship Barnabas as Jupiter, probably because Barnabas was older than Paul and perhaps larger in stature, and Paul as Mercury, or the messenger of the gods, because Paul was the chief speaker. So they're giving them these names of gods so that they can worship them, basically, just like Greek gods. Verse 13, then the priest of Jupiter, which was before their city, brought oxen and garlands unto the gates, and would have done sacrifice with the people. So they're getting ready to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas, thinking they must be sent by God. So again, the Greeks aren't seeing this idea of priesthood and priesthood authority and things like they have in the Christian church, that Paul and Barnabas are doing. They're thinking through their perspective of what it means to deal with God. Okay, so we can't fault the Greeks for wanting to worship Paul and Barnabas and wanting to do these things, because that's how they saw religion. They didn't know different. So they're going to have to think different to accept and follow what Paul and Barnabas have been teaching them. Now verse 14, which when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of, they rent their clothes and ran in among the people, crying out. So when they rent their clothes, they tear their clothes, and that is a sign, basically. They thought that this was blasphemous. We aren't the ones that you need to worship. It's not us. That's what he says in verse 15, saying, sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein. Now, this is an important verse. This verse is found also in the book of Enoch. Not exactly word for word, but pretty close to it, basically. There's a lot of similarities between this verse and a verse in the book of Enoch. So we can see Enoch's book, which isn't in the Bible, is having an influence on the teachings of these early apostles. They probably had read it and were familiar with it back then. Verse 16, Paul is continuing on, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. And with these sayings, scarce restrained they the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them. So they're like, guys, don't worship us. Worship God. We're just his messengers. We're just normal people like the rest of you, basically. Okay, so here's another story, verse 19. And there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium. So now these are people that have, if you realize, oh, Paul and Barnabas started in Antioch, and then they went to other places and over to Iconium. These are people that are following the missionaries, who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. These people are going behind the missionaries to anti the people. Basically, they're teaching against what Paul and Barnabas are saying, trying to tell people, no, these guys are fake, they're false, don't listen to them. And then they catch up to them again in Iconium and they stone them. It sounds like probably they hit Paul on the head. He fell down dead. So they dragged his body out of the city. Verse 20, howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city. And the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So he wasn't dead, but then he got up, went back in, stayed the night, and then left with Barnabas the next day. Verse 21, when they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned again to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. So realize this is Asia Minor, okay? Not Syria, Antioch, Asia Minor, Antioch, okay? So near Turkey. So these are further out areas that they're preaching in. And now, verse 22, confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, that we must, through much tribulation, enter into the kingdom of God. So verse 22 is reinforcing the idea of martyrdom. We will suffer at the hands of people who hate God, basically. And if you notice, they follow their tracks back. So imagine being a missionary. You spend all this time going to these cities preaching, only to find out somebody is going behind you telling lies about you to get people to not believe you. And then they try to kill you. And then you recover, and then you basically have to go back to all these cities to reestablish the faith of the people. That's a lot of work. Talk about a heck of a first missionary effort. I mean, really. So, verse 23, and when they had ordained them elders in every church and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. So these are setting up not lots of different churches. They're setting up local church leadership. So it's all the same church, just local leadership in these cities to help take care of the people day to day. That is what they're doing. Basically, they're ordaining elders, they're ordaining people with priesthood authority so that they can then administer the church in the local area. Verse 24, after they had passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. And when they had preached the word in Perga, they went unto Attalia, and thence sailed to Antioch, from whence they had been recommended to the grace of God for the work which they fulfilled. So now they're getting done with their first missionary efforts. They kind of went out a ways, and now they're coming back. Verse 27, and when they were come, they had gathered the church together. They rehearsed all that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith unto the Gentiles. And there they abode long time with the disciples. Now, while Paul is in Antioch, we think that he wrote several letters to some of these churches and to other groups. And so we'll hear some of this come out in the rest of Paul's teachings as we get more into his specific letters that he writes to people later after the book of Acts, basically. Let's jump over to chapter 15 as the challenges the church is facing continue to grow. We'll see you then.